A faint beam of light streamed through a crack in the boarded-up window, landing on Sophia's tear-streaked face. She blinked, disoriented, as her mind scrambled to make sense of her surroundings. The cold, stark walls around her offered no answers, and the heavy metallic door stood as a silent reminder of her entrapment. Her heart raced as memories from the previous night began to resurface. She remembered the argument Daniel, her husband, his face twisted in anger as he shouted words that cut through her like a blade. "You should have stayed in your lane, Sophia," he had spat, his voice cold and final. Then there was the darkness, a haze. She had been pushed, dragged, and locked away. Sophia's throat tightened as the realization sank in she was being held prisoner. But why? The answer came as a gut-wrenching jolt. Daniel's second wedding. She had uncovered his secret, a sinister plan he had been meticulously weaving behind her back. He wasn't just cheating, he was remarrying without bothering to end his marriage to her. She pressed her trembling hands against the door, her palms flat against the cold metal. She pushed, pounded, and screamed, but her cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. A wave of despair crashed over her. Then she heard it faint murmurs from outside. Her ears strained to pick up the conversation. Daniel's voice was unmistakable, sharp, and commanding. "Make sure she stays locked up until the ceremony is over. She can't ruin this for me." Sophia's blood boiled as the betrayal set in deeper. She wasn't just a nuisance to him anymore, she was an obstacle to be eliminated. She pressed her ear harder against the door, catching snippets of another voice, a woman's, perhaps his mistress. Their laughter rang out, cruel and dismissive, as if her suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience. Sophia stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. Anger bubbled in her chest, replacing her initial shock. How dare he? The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, had turned into a stranger, a monster. As the reality of her situation settled in, so did a steely resolve. She refused to let this be the end of her story. If Daniel thought he could silence her, he was gravely mistaken. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help her escape. Her gaze landed on a rusty nail protruding from the wooden floorboards. Slowly, carefully, she crouched down, pulling it free with trembling hands. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with determination. Sophia clenched the nail in her fist, her mind racing. She would find a way out. And when she did, she wouldn't just escape, she would destroy the life Daniel was so desperate to protect. For now, she was locked away, but that wouldn't last. She would make sure of it. Sophia leaned her back against the cold, unyielding door, clutching the rusty nail she'd found. Her breathing steadied as her mind pulled her into the past, replaying the moments that had led to this nightmare. It hadn't always been this way. Daniel had once been charming, attentive, and everything she thought she wanted in a partner. Their marriage had started with so much promise. She could still picture the way he had smiled at her on their wedding day, his hands warm as they held hers, his vows full of devotion. But that was before the cracks began to show. Sophia had first noticed it 6 months ago. Daniel had grown distant, his late-night work meetings stretching longer, his phone always out of reach. At first, she had dismissed it as stress. Every marriage had its ebbs and flows, right? But then came the lies, so small and innocuous at first that she nearly overlooked them. "I had to grab drinks with the team," he would say, though his shirt smelled faintly of a floral perfume that wasn't hers. "I've been swamped with emails," he would insist, while his phone buzzed with messages he refused to open in front of her. Her trust began to erode as the inconsistencies piled up. One night, when Daniel left for yet another urgent meeting, Sophia's curiosity and unease finally overcame her. She logged into their shared tablet, where she found his email account still open. What she discovered made her stomach turn. There were emails from an unfamiliar woman, Marissa. At first, they seemed harmless, discussing work projects and logistics, but as she scrolled further, the tone shifted. Inside jokes, pet names, plans for trips she had never heard of. And then, the dagger. "I can't wait for us to finally be together. Soon. This will all be behind us." The words blurred as Sophia's vision clouded with tears. She clutched the tablet, her knuckles turning white. This wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal on a scale she couldn't fathom. When Daniel returned home that night, Sophia confronted him, her voice trembling with rage and hurt. But instead of apologies or explanations, he had laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that cut deeper than his words. "You should have stayed out of it," he had said, his eyes devoid of remorse. "This doesn't concern you." Didn't concern her? She was his wife. Over the weeks that followed, Daniel's behavior only grew bolder. He didn't bother hiding his calls with Marissa or the documents that hinted at a second wedding. Sophia tried to find the strength to leave, but she couldn't. Her name was tied to everything they owned, and Daniel made sure she felt trapped. Then, just days before this supposed wedding, she had threatened to expose him. She had found more than emails, bank statements showing secret transfers, and falsified documents tying Marissa into Daniel's schemes. "If you don't call it off," she had said, "I'll make sure everyone knows." That was when his mask of civility had finally dropped, and now here she was, locked in a room like some disposable pawn in his grand game. But Sophia wasn't disposable. She was no longer the woman who blindly trusted him, who accepted his lies with quiet pain. The memories snapped back to the present. Sophia stood and paced the small room, her fingers gripping the nail like a lifeline. Outside, Daniel's voice rose again, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Everything will go perfectly," he said, his words muffled but clear. "She's out of the way now. Nothing can stop us." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. He thought she was defeated, silenced. But he had underestimated her resolve. This betrayal wasn't just about her heartbreak anymore. It was about justice. It was about taking back her power. Daniel might have locked her away, but the cage wouldn't hold. Sophia would make sure of it. And when she finally got out, the secrets he was so desperate to protect would be the very thing that destroyed him. Sophia paced the cramped room, her mind racing with a mix of fury and determination. Every time she heard the faint hum of laughter or voices outside, it reignited her resolve. Daniel thought she was powerless, locked away like an inconvenient secret. But he was wrong. She wasn't going to sit and wait for rescue. She was going to free herself. Her eyes swept the room for the 100th time, cataloging every detail. The boarded-up window allowed only a sliver of light, casting long shadows on the floor. The heavy door was locked from the outside, and the walls were bare and unyielding. It was like a prison, but Sophia knew that every prison had its weak points. She crouched near the base of the door and inspected the lock. Though she didn't know much about mechanics, she could see it was old, with a rusted latch that had likely been in disrepair for years. Her fingers tightened around the nail she had pried from the floorboards. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She slipped the nail into the keyhole, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't as simple as it looked in the movies, but she refused to give up. The metal scraped and clinked, each sound a mix of hope and frustration. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she worked, sweat beading on her forehead. Her arms ached, and she bit her lip to stifle the curses rising in her throat. Finally, with a defeated sigh, she pulled the nail free. The lock was stubborn, but so was she. Sophia sat back against the wall, her breathing uneven. For a moment, doubt began to creep in, whispering insidious thoughts into her mind. What if I can't get out? What if they find me trying and make things worse? But she quickly shoved those thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to give up now. She thought of everything Daniel had done, the lies, the betrayal, the audacity of planning a wedding while she was still his wife. Anger fueled her resolve like oxygen to a flame. She pushed herself to her feet and searched the room again, refusing to believe there was no other way. That's when she noticed the hinges on the door. They weren't visible on the inside, but she realized the door frame itself looked slightly loose. Sophia examined it closer, prying at the edges of the frame with her nail. A small splinter of wood gave way, and hope flickered. It wasn't much progress, but it was enough to reinvigorate her determination. Using the nail in sheer force, she worked at the frame, chipping away piece by piece. Her hands ached, splinters embedding into her fingertips, but she didn't stop. With each small crack in the wood, her heart beat faster. She could almost taste freedom. Finally, she managed to create a gap wide enough to see the latch holding the door shut. It wasn't just rusted, it was poorly secured. With one last determined shove, she wedged the nail into the gap and leveraged her full weight against it. The door groaned, and then snap. Sophia stumbled back as the latch broke loose, and her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the door for a moment, as if unable to believe it had worked. Then, slowly, she pushed it open just wide enough to peek through. The hallway beyond was dimly lit and quiet, but she could hear faint murmurs from down the corridor. She crouched low, every sense heightened as she crept forward. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but each step brought a renewed sense of control. Sophia wasn't just escaping. She was planning her next move. She would find a way to expose Daniel for what he truly was, to make sure his lies, manipulations, and cruelty came to light. But first, she had to get out of this house undetected. As she made her way toward the faint outline of an exit, her heart swelled with determination. Sophia wasn't just running from Daniel. She was running toward justice, and she was just getting started. Sophia slipped through the hallway, her breath shallow and measured as she edged closer to freedom. The faint glow of a window in the distance seemed almost taunting, a reminder of the world she'd been so violently cut off from. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. She reached a small alcove and crouched low, giving herself a moment to collect her thoughts. The room she had escaped from was now behind her, but the bigger battle lay ahead. What she had wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was a fight for justice, for reclaiming her life from the web of deceit Daniel had spun. It didn't take long for Sophia to realize that leaving the house outright wasn't an option, not yet. Too many voices echoed through the corridors, and every shadow seemed to move with suspicion. She needed a place to regroup, to think. Spotting a slightly ajar door, she slipped into what appeared to be a storage room. It was cluttered and dusty, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs, but it was quiet, and for now, that was enough. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. Sophia's mind raced. She had no phone, no way to contact anyone outside, and no evidence of Daniel's actions yet. Her escape wasn't just about her survival anymore, she needed to ensure that Daniel faced consequences. Her thoughts turned inward, back to the moments that had shaped her resolve. She remembered how isolated she had felt in the weeks leading up to this day, her instincts warning her of Daniel's growing deceit. Each lie, each cruel dismissal, had left her feeling powerless. But now, that same sense of betrayal fueled her determination. "You've made me stronger than you realize." "Daniel," she whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Sophia knew she couldn't afford to break. She thought of her younger self, the girl who had once been fiercely independent, unafraid to take risks. Somewhere along the way, Daniel's manipulation had dulled that part of her. But now, in this moment, she felt it returning. Sophia's mind snapped back to reality as she heard faint footsteps in the hallway. Her breath caught and she crouched lower, peeking through a crack in the door. To her relief, the footsteps moved past without stopping. Once the silence returned, an idea struck her. She remembered Isabel, her oldest friend. Isabel had always been her confidante, the one person who had warned her about Daniel's controlling tendencies from the start. If there was anyone who could help, it was her. She needed a phone. Carefully, Sophia began rifling through the boxes and shelves in the storage room. Her hands brushed against useless items, old files, broken furniture, until she found a dusty landline phone shoved into a corner. She lifted it, her heart pounding as she plugged it into a nearby socket. The dial tone hummed in her ear. Relief flooded through her as she quickly punched in Isabel's number, praying her friend would pick up. "Hello," Isabel's familiar voice came through the line, her tone cautious. "It's me," Sophia whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Isabel, I need your help." Over the next few minutes, Sophia recounted everything: the affair, the second wedding, the betrayal, and her current escape. Isabel's voice shifted from shock to anger to determination. "I knew that man was no good," Isabel hissed. "Sophia, we're going to fix this. Where are you now?" "I don't know," Sophia admitted, glancing around the room. "Somewhere in his house. I'm not safe, Isabel. But I'm not leaving without exposing him." "Good," Isabel said firmly. "You don't have to do this alone. Let me make some calls. We'll figure out how to get you out and make sure Daniel gets what's coming to him." As the call ended, Sophia felt a surge of strength she hadn't felt in months. Isabel's unwavering support reminded her that she wasn't as isolated as Daniel had tried to make her believe. Sophia tucked the phone away and took stock of her situation. Her immediate priority was staying hidden, but her ultimate goal had shifted. She wasn't just escaping. She was preparing for war. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sophia smiled, small and determined. Daniel had underestimated her, and that would be his undoing. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her fight. Sophia sat on the dusty floor of the storage room, her back pressed against the wall. The weight of everything she had endured bore down on her, but it didn't crush her, it sharpened her focus. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. Daniel had stolen her trust, her freedom, and her dignity. Now, she was going to take everything back. Her conversation with Isabel had ignited a spark within her, a reminder that she wasn't fighting alone. But she knew this battle wasn't just personal, it was about exposing the lies and manipulation Daniel had built his life on. He had locked her away to silence her, but his biggest mistake was thinking she would stay quiet. Sophia slipped out of the storage room, her movements careful and deliberate. She remembered the layout of Daniel's house from better days and made her way to his study. If he was hiding anything incriminating, it would be there. The study was empty, its dark wooden shelves lined with books and folders. Sophia's eyes scanned the room until they landed on a locked drawer in the desk. She didn't have time to search for a key, so she grabbed a letter opener from the desk and worked it into the lock. After a few tense moments, the drawer popped open. Inside, she found a collection of documents and a laptop. She rifled through the papers, her pulse quickening as she uncovered evidence of Daniel's schemes: bank statements, fraudulent contracts, and what appeared to be a prenup for his second wedding. Sophia powered on the laptop, praying it wouldn't require a password. To her relief, it opened directly to his email account. There, she found a trail of messages confirming not just the wedding plans but also large, suspicious financial transactions tied to Daniel's company. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She needed to get this information out before Daniel noticed anything missing. Sophia grabbed the laptop and documents, carefully returning to the storage room. She called Isabel again, detailing what she had found. "I need you to get in touch with someone who can help me expose this," Sophia said, her voice firm. "A journalist, a lawyer, someone who knows how to handle this kind of evidence." I already have someone in mind, Isabel replied without hesitation. But Sophia, you need to be careful. If Daniel catches you before this goes public. I know, Sophia interrupted. But I can't back down now. This is my chance to end his games for good. Isabel promised to set up a meeting with a private investigator, someone who could help Sophia build an airtight case. Over the next few hours, Sophia worked tirelessly. She used the laptop to transfer files to a secure cloud drive, ensuring she had backups of everything. She took photos of every document, every email, and every damning transaction. The deeper she dug, the darker the picture became. Daniel wasn't just a liar or a cheater, he was a fraud. The financial records pointed to embezzlement from his company, with funds being funneled into offshore accounts. The implications were staggering. Sophia's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her anymore. Daniel's actions had hurt countless others, and she couldn't allow him to get away with it. Sophia's hands shook as she finished uploading the last file. She couldn't stop replaying Daniel's words in her mind, make sure she stays locked up until the ceremony is over. He thought he had won. He thought his lies, his power, and his money could bury the truth. But Sophia wasn't the same person he had tried to break. She called Isabel one last time. I have everything I need, Sophia said, her voice steady. Now we just need to make the reveal. Isabel hesitated. Are you sure about this? Exposing him publicly, it's risky. He'll come after you with everything he has. Let him, Sophia replied. He's already taken everything from me. Now it's his turn to lose. Sophia and Isabel devised a bold strategy. Sophia would crash the wedding Daniel had planned so meticulously, turning his celebration into his downfall. They invited key individuals, journalists, legal experts, and people Daniel had wronged under the guise of a celebratory announcement. Every step was calculated. Isabel's private investigator would ensure the evidence was authenticated, and the press would be ready to document the entire reveal. Sophia felt the weight of her actions as the plan came together, but she refused to falter. This wasn't revenge born of spite, it was justice, long overdue. With everything in place, Sophia prepared for the day she would face Daniel again, not as his victim, but as the woman who would dismantle his carefully constructed world. The stage was set, and the reckoning was near. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden light, its elegant chandeliers casting a warm glow over the sea of well-dressed guests. The room buzzed with excitement, laughter, and clinking glasses as Daniel stood at the center, charming his audience with the charisma Sophia had once fallen for. He wore his signature smirk, a man convinced of his invincibility. Sophia stood just outside the grand entrance, hidden from view. Her heart pounded in her chest, but not from fear. This was the moment she had been preparing for. In her hands was a folder filled with damning evidence, her phone loaded with the files she had painstakingly backed up. Isabel stood by her side, her steady presence a source of comfort. You've got this, Isabel whispered, giving her a reassuring nod. Sophia took a deep breath. She wasn't the woman Daniel had locked away anymore. She was stronger, smarter, and ready to show the world the truth. The room quieted as Sophia walked in, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd like a gust of wind. Daniel's confident smile faltered when his eyes met hers. Sophia, he said, his voice strained. What are you doing here? She ignored him, stepping onto the small platform where the band had been playing moments earlier. Taking the microphone in her hand, she addressed the crowd. Thank you all for coming, Sophia began, her voice steady and calm despite the storm brewing inside her. I know many of you are here to celebrate what you think is a joyous occasion, Daniel's wedding. But tonight, we're not celebrating love. We're uncovering the truth, the crowd murmured in confusion. All eyes flicking between Sophia and Daniel. Sophia held up the folder. What you see here is evidence of Daniel's betrayal, not just to me but to everyone who has trusted him. Lies, fraud, and manipulation. It's all here. She turned to the projection screen behind her and clicked a button on her phone. Images of incriminating emails and financial statements flashed on the screen, each one more damning than the last. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as the depth of Daniel's schemes became undeniable. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of red. Sophia, stop this. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, Sophia shot back, her voice ringing with authority. You locked me in a room to silence me. You thought you could get away with it. But you underestimated me. She addressed the crowd again, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. Many of you trusted Daniel. Some of you worked with him, invested in his ventures, or even called him a friend. But this man is a fraud. He's been stealing, cheating, and manipulating for years. Journalists in the crowd began snapping photos and jotting down notes. The press Sophia had invited was doing exactly what she'd hoped, documenting every explosive detail. The bride-to-be, Marissa, stood frozen in shock. Her gaze darted from the screen to Daniel, her disbelief turning into fury. Is this true? She demanded, her voice trembling. Daniel stammered. It's not what it looks like, Sophia cut him off. It's exactly what it looks like, Marissa. The emails don't lie. Neither do the bank statements. He's been funneling money into offshore accounts and using people like pawns, just like he used you. Marissa's face twisted in disgust. She stormed out of the room, leaving Daniel to face the growing hostility of the crowd alone. Sophia stepped down from the platform, standing tall amidst the chaos she had unleashed. Guests began confronting Daniel, demanding explanations. The journalists pressed him with questions he couldn't answer. "Did you really think you could bury the truth forever?" Sophia said, her voice low enough for only Daniel to hear. His mask of confidence crumbled. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, his tone venomous. Sophia met his gaze without flinching. "No, Daniel. You're the one who's going to pay. For everything." As security escorted Daniel out under the growing pressure from the guests and media, Sophia felt a wave of relief wash over her. Isabel approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," Isabel said, a smile of pride on her face. "This is just the beginning," Sophia replied. "Now it's time for him to face real consequences." She turned to the crowd one last time. "Thank you for listening. I know this isn't what you expected tonight, but it's what needed to happen. The truth matters, and it always comes out in the end." With that, Sophia walked out of the ballroom, her head held high. She didn't need to stay and watch the fallout. She had done what she came to do: expose Daniel and reclaim her power. As she stepped into the cool night air, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't the end. It was the start of her new chapter. And Daniel's reign of lies was finally over. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Sophia stepped inside, her heart steady despite the weight of the moment. Rows of spectators, journalists, former colleagues of Daniel, and a few curious onlookers filled the gallery. This wasn't just a divorce proceeding, it was a public reckoning. Across the room, Daniel sat with his lawyer, his once confident demeanor replaced by a strained, defensive posture. Beside him, his mother, another key player in his schemes, shifted uncomfortably. Sophia felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was their day of reckoning, and she was ready to face them. Her lawyer, Mr. Hart, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got this," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Sophia nodded, clutching the folder containing the evidence she had painstakingly gathered. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began with both sides presenting their opening statements. Mr. Hart rose first. "Your Honor, today we present a case not just of emotional and financial abuse but of systematic deceit and fraud. My client, Mrs. Sophia Adams, was locked away and silenced while the defendant attempted to marry another woman and continue his financial schemes unchecked. We intend to prove beyond doubt that Mr. Daniel Adams and his accomplices engaged in illegal activities, betraying not only my client but also his business partners and investors." Daniel's lawyer, Mr. Grayson, stood next, his tone defensive. "Your Honor, the defense asserts that Mrs. Adams is overreacting to marital disputes and presenting unfounded accusations. We will show that these allegations lack merit and are based on personal vendettas rather than facts." Sophia remained composed, her resolve unwavering. She had the truth on her side, and soon the courtroom would see it too. Mr. Hart began by presenting the evidence. First, he played recordings of Daniel's abusive conversations with Sophia. The courtroom was silent as Daniel's cruel, condescending tone filled the air. Gasps echoed from the gallery, and even the judge's expression hardened. Next came the financial records. Projected onto a screen were bank statements, offshore transactions, and emails that painted a clear picture of Daniel's fraudulent activities. "Your Honor," Mr. Hart said, his voice firm, "these documents show that Mr. Adams embezzled funds from his company, funneled money into secret accounts, and planned to remarry illegally without dissolving his existing marriage. These are not the actions of an innocent man." The defense attempted to discredit the evidence, but each time they faltered. The documents were authentic, the recordings undeniable, and the timeline airtight. Several witnesses were called to the stand, including Isabel, who recounted how Sophia had contacted her from captivity. She was terrified, Isabel said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. But even then, she was determined to fight back. She didn't just want to escape, she wanted to make sure Daniel's actions came to light. The private investigator, Mr. Green, presented his findings, detailing Daniel's history of financial manipulation and fraudulent dealings. "The evidence speaks for itself," he concluded. When Daniel took the stand, his confident facade cracked under cross-examination. His explanations were evasive, his excuses flimsy. "Mr. Adams," Mr. Hart said, his tone sharp, "are you denying that you locked your wife in a room and attempted to marry another woman?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes darting to his lawyer. I didn't mean for things to go that far." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the admission sealing his fate. After hours of testimony and evidence review, the judge leaned forward, her expression stern. "In light of the overwhelming evidence, this court finds that Mr. Adams not only committed financial fraud, but also violated the trust and well-being of his wife, Mrs. Sophia Adams." As such, I am granting Mrs. Adams a divorce with full asset recovery, along with punitive damages. Furthermore, this court recommends that criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement be pursued against Mr. Adams and his accomplices. The gavel struck, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a final nail in Daniel's coffin. As the spectators filed out, reporters surrounded Sophia, bombarding her with questions. She answered a few, her voice calm and measured, before retreating to a quiet corner with Isabel and Mr. Hart. "You did it," Isabel said, her eyes glistening with pride. "We did it," Sophia replied, allowing herself a small, triumphant smile. Daniel's downfall was complete, but for Sophia, the battle had never been about vengeance. It was about reclaiming her life and ensuring justice was served. As she stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, she felt a profound sense of freedom. The fight was over, and she had won not just in the courtroom, but in reclaiming her dignity, her strength, and her future. This wasn't just the end of her story with Daniel. It was the beginning of the life she was finally free to live. The countryside stretched out before Sophia, a canvas of vibrant greens and golds bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. She stood on the porch of her small, newly rented cottage, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The air here was quiet, still, and full of possibilities, a stark contrast to the chaos and heartbreak she had left behind. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt peace. Sophia sat on the wicker chair she'd placed near the edge of the porch and let her mind wander back to everything she had endured. It wasn't just the betrayal or the abuse that haunted her, it was how far she had allowed herself to drift from the strong, independent woman she used to be. She thought of the courtroom, the judgment in her favor, and the shocked expressions of the people who had once believed Daniel's lies. She had walked into that courthouse broken, but she had walked out whole. Justice hadn't just been served, it had freed her from the chains of her past. But the victory hadn't been about revenge. No, her triumph lay in reclaiming herself. Sophia looked around her new home, a modest yet cozy space she had filled with little reminders of who she was and who she wanted to become. The bookshelves were lined with novels she had once loved but abandoned during her marriage. The walls were adorned with photographs of places she dreamed of visiting. The days following the trial had been bittersweet. She'd packed her belongings, finalized her affairs, and left the city that had been her home and her prison for so long. The decision to move was difficult but necessary. She wanted a clean slate, a life untainted by Daniel's shadow. Here, she had the freedom to rediscover herself. Sophia spent her days planting a small garden in the backyard, reconnecting with old friends and journaling her thoughts. Writing had always been her solace, and now it became her therapy. Each word she scribbled was a step toward healing, a reminder of her resilience. Her evenings were filled with quiet moments like this one, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. There were no phone calls to dread, no lies to unravel, no toxic voices to drown out. She had started volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering support to those going through what she had survived. Sharing her story with others wasn't just cathartic, it was empowering. She wanted to help other women find their strength, just as she had. Sophia's thoughts turned to the future. The uncertainty that had once terrified her now felt exhilarating. For the first time in years, she could dream without limits. Maybe she would return to school, travel the world, or finally start the small business she'd always fantasized about. She smiled to herself, imagining all the possibilities. This time, the choices were hers alone. As the stars began to peek through the twilight sky, Sophia stood and stretched, feeling the gentle ache of muscles worked through honest labor. She looked out at the vast expanse of land and felt a surge of gratitude. Her past with Daniel had been painful, but it had also taught her valuable lessons. She had learned to trust her instincts, to stand up for herself, and to value her worth. Most importantly, she had learned that she didn't need anyone else to define her happiness. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet strength. The past was behind her, the scars a reminder of her battles but no longer a source of pain. The woman Daniel had tried to break no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and unshakably free. Sophia walked back into her cottage, closing the door softly behind her. The world outside was vast and full of opportunity, and she was ready to embrace it. Her story wasn't just one of survival, it was a story of rebirth. And this time, she wrote the chapters of her life.